which we all know by now, 15 minutes for presentation, 4 minutes discussant, and then 10 minutes for your question. And I will chair and go right into my presentation, which is, I'm going to present joint work with Jonathan Argent, who used to be at the IGC in Rwanda and is now independent consultant, and with Imran Rasool, who is professor at the University College London and is also at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, where I myself am also based. The work I'm presenting to you is a study we're doing where we're exploiting supply-side constraints in the so-called Girinka, 1 cow per poor family program in Rwanda, to estimate the additional impact of receiving complementary training with a cow. And we're looking at different outcomes there. Girinka, of which I'll give you more details on the next slides, is one of many recently implemented ultra-poor poverty programs, so where assets are given for free to the very poor. Often this is livestock, and with that they're typically also trained quite intensively on how to utilize this asset. And the design of these programs is basically based on the stylized fact that the poor lack both capital and skills. And there's by now quite some evidence out there that these programs are promising. Just to give you one example, Bandiera and colleagues evaluated one of the probably biggest of these programs implemented by BRAC in Bangladesh. They reached by now about 500,000 of the poor, and they find an increase in earnings by about 36% and an increase in consumption by 8%. And then there's a number of other studies which also show positive effects. And so nowadays these type of programs are piloted in at least 10 countries around the world. But what they all have in common is that they bundle this asset with the training. And we know actually very little, if anything, about the relative rates of returns of these individual components. And this is what we try to shed some light on here with this study. So the program that we're looking at is called Girinka, as I was mentioning, implemented in Rwanda, and was started in 2006 by President Paul Kagame, and basically was seen as a homegrown solution to poverty through increased agricultural productivity. The key characteristics are that beneficiaries are given a cow. Ideally, this should be a cow in calf, so that very soon after receiving this asset, the cow would calf, and then the cow would produce milk. And today, but it often didn't actually happen like this, but okay. Today, about 100,000 cows have been distributed under this program. It has been jointly implemented by government agencies as well as NGOs. So there's quite a lot of NGOs involved. Some of the bigger ones you might know is Haifa International and Send a Cow. So around Christmas you get these cards. What do you want to? And depending on the distributor, they might give some support package and or some training with the cow. The beneficiaries, they are selected by the communities. There's a number of criteria, and it is the people themselves in the communities that decide who meets these criteria. And they are that the household should not already own a cow. They should not have too much land, so that they're actually poor, but they should have some land, out of which some needs to be allocated to grow feed for the animal. And they also need to build a shed. And then another characteristic is this passing on of the gift. It's called the first female animal that's born will then be passed on to another beneficiary. In the study, we used 3 different types of data. We did a household survey among beneficiaries that were from a stratified random sample. We also do a survey with the government veterinarians that are operating in these areas. And in each sector is 1 veterinarian, and we managed to interview every single one that is in our survey area, which is 30. And then we have interviews, unstructured interviews with NGOs to get some information on how they implement things. So based on this, the households, beneficiary households, just some statistics. On average, the household head is 47 years. 1/3 of them have no education. At most, primary education is altogether basically 90% of the sample. All of them, mostly all of them are farmers, live in relatively big households of 5 to 6 members and in small structures. From the sector veterinarians, we get some information in how remote these areas are, and they're relatively remote. 23% of the villages can only reach by foot, and then it takes about 1.5 hours to get there. On average, all these villages can be reached within about 50 minutes. And every village is visited by the sector vet about once every week. 45% of the cows that are distributed are Ancoles, or the local breed, little picture. And the remaining ones are exotic, so that could be Jersey or Frisian, because the program also tries to increase or to introduce more hybrid cows. But a lot of these are also crossbred. And so the first cows were distributed, as I said, in 2006. So some of the beneficiaries have had the cow for 8 years by now, most of them in 2009, 2010. Now, 30% of these beneficiaries report that they have received some type of training with the animal, and that's what we are concentrating on in the study. What is the impact of receiving this training with the cow? So we're not going to say anything about the impact of the program altogether, but just looking really at this training. Now, obviously, this training might be endogenous. We don't have a randomized controlled trial here, so we have to worry about that. And there can be two kind of selections that might be going on. On the one hand, we might have that the beneficiaries say, please, I need to know something about how to feed the animal. Can you please teach me how to do that? Or we might have that the institutions decide, you really need to know something about shed building, so I'm going to tell you something. Now, we believe that both of these selections might be unlikely. For one, that is because the NGOs, they see this training and the cow as a bundle. And it's an integral part of the process to also give training when they give this cow. And I need to say, I was mentioning it, but to stress it again, some of the NGOs don't provide training and some do, so that's where we get the variation. But those that do, they see it as a bundle, and they also report that attendance is typically not a problem, or is not a problem. And this was independently verified also by the sector veterinarians whom we asked about the training that is provided by NGOs, and all of them said that people attend these trainings. And the selection on the side of the providers, we also don't think that that's likely because of this process, how the beneficiaries are selected. So they're selected by the community, and the NGO cannot say, I don't give it to you, I actually give it to someone else. So we're quite confident that it should be exogenous to the degree that we can be able to say this. However, we do find that there are some differences between those that receive training and those that don't. They don't seem to be systematically better off or worse off, but so we, for example, find that they're from larger households, those that receive training, and that they reside in live in more remote locations. On the other hand, they are less likely to be female-headed and less likely to receive one of these traditional cows. And we don't find any differences in the age of the household head, education, in the assets that the household owned before they received the cow, and also in the number of visits from the sector veterinarian. But anyway, it's important that we account for this information, obviously, and that we check the robustness of results. So that is the specification we look at, very straightforward, so I don't go into it. Now, before I show you the results, what we find, just very briefly, this training is an aggregate indicator of a number of trainings. So the beneficiaries typically get trained on two different issues. Mostly it's shed building. A bit more than half also receive training on feed, some on manure, some on diseases. Shed building might not be too obvious, but it's really quite important because it reduces the likelihood of the animal falling sick. Because very importantly, it is how they treat the manure and the urine, so the animal doesn't stand in that and so on. And it also reduces the likelihood of the animal actually dying because they're not exposed to extreme weather and so on. So given that it's an aggregate indicator, there's a number of outcomes that we might think could be affected by this training. So what we look at is milk production, how they use the milk, do they increase their earnings from this milk. We look at the herd size, and we look at asset accumulation. So the tables that I'm going to show, that's big. They're all set up the same way. The first row is always the impact of the training indicator that we look at. Then we show some of the covariates, the coefficients of the covariates, but you'll see in the bottom we account for a lot more than we show. In the following tables, every column will be one outcome indicator. Here, every column is the same one, and we introduce bit by bit the different types of covariates. First, what I would like you to show is that if you look at the different specifications, the coefficients are extremely robust, so the signs, the significance, and the magnitude are quite consistent for the different specifications. So if we don't account for anything, we'll see a 15% increase in the likelihood of producing milk from the training. And if we account for all these different covariates, then we find a 14% increase, and there's no significant difference between these two coefficients. Now, what does this 14% mean? So 25% of the non-trained households were producing milk. So a 14 percentage point increase corresponds to 56% increase in the likelihood of producing milk because of this training that they received. If we compare that to the ideal scenario, then on average, these cows should produce a calf every 12 months, then give milk for 10 months, so that at any point in time, about 67% of the cows should be producing milk. So these 25 plus 14, 39% people produce milk is still far off from the ideal, but the training does seem to narrow the gap significantly. Now, do they also produce more? Yes, we find that on average per day, they produce 1.5 liters milk more because of the training. And this is a 162% increase in the amount of milk produced. And in the third column, you see the amount of milk produced per animal. And this is also still very significant in the number of liters. And so what we conclude from that, it's not only that the herd size changes so that they have more animals that produce the milk, but it seems that the productivity of the animals is increasing, which could partly be because they're more regularly inseminated, or also because they get sick less or just get better feed, for example. What do they do with the milk? So we find that they're more likely to consume milk and that they're more likely to sell milk. On the intensive margin, we don't find a change in how much they consume, but we do find a change, and I'm not showing these, but we do find a change in how much they sell. So on average, they sell, because of the training, 1.24 liters more in a day. And that translates into earnings. So we find an about 80 cents in US dollars increase in daily earnings from selling the milk. That's a 6-fold increase because of the training. We also find this if we look at different earnings indicators. So in the income section, we ask how much did you earn from milk in the last month and in the last year, and we find this confirmed. Unfortunately, we don't have any information on labor supply, so we can't really say anything about whether they move from one to the other activity. But we have started to look at household income in general, and we find a significant impact there as well. But we don't have the results in the paper yet. Now then I was saying that productivity can increase because you have more animals or because you have more productive cows, and we show evidence that the cows are more productive, and we don't find a change in the herd size altogether. It seems stable, but we do find that more cows are born to the farm and more cows are sold. And that makes sense because only if the calves are born, the cows also produce milk. But they seem to be selling these as well. So that means households get income from selling milk and from selling animals. Unfortunately, we can't look at savings. We don't have the information, but we can look at whether they use this money to accumulate assets. So the last table I'm going to show, one more after this, is the asset impacts on assets. And we do find that asset accumulation seems to be taking place. So the households are more likely to earn a higher number of assets, which seems to be driven especially by stove ownership, but also bicycles and mattresses. So we find the impact on they are more likely to produce, they produce more milk. Oh, I have 2 minutes, okay, I'm not summarizing. So there's two things that could be driving these results. One of them is they also receive, some of these households receive a support package, which could be material to build a shed, which could be medicines, could be feed. So that could be driving these results. Another thing is I was mentioning the sector veterinarians already. They provide also training. So maybe this training that is subsequently provided by the sector that is driving what we're finding here. But when we account for this information, we find three interesting things. I'm showing here now the main outcomes that we looked at before. So for one, we still find that our training indicator is very significant and the size doesn't change very much. The only difference we find is in the number of cows sold. That's the first one. The second one, there's no impact of these additional things provided with the cow, so that doesn't seem to make any difference. And we also basically find hardly any impact from the training that is provided by the sector veterinarians subsequently, except for the number of cows sold. So what do we make out of all of this? So while we should probably say it's suggestive evidence, but quite novel because we know very little about it, we find that the provision of training with the asset has permanent and economically significant impacts on households' milk production, livestock productivity, the earnings, and asset accumulation. Importantly, it seems that subsequent training doesn't have these effects, that it is important to have the training together with the cow in the beginning, which kind of, if you think about it, makes sense. So one thing we learned from the sector veterinarians is that there the selection into training is much more important. So you can imagine my animal falls sick, and then I go, please, can you help me? What do I need to do? And then it's more mitigating than preventing anything. So we can say from these findings that capital in the form of livestock and skills are complementary. What would be interesting then to look at further is what would be the optimal design? How do we want to really design such a program? So we can already say with the cow directly is good, but how much, how intensive, and so on, that would be, I guess, the next step of this type of research. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation, and I really enjoyed reading the paper, and it was, yeah, I want to congratulate you on that. So I have a few questions, some more requesting clarifications and some on the methodology or the identification strategies. So to begin with, I think I should start from the last table you showed us, that you try to look at the impacts of this intervention, that's the training with the asset distribution on asset accumulation. And I think what you have, the data is more of like a cross-sectional data, and I think you should be a bit careful to talk about asset accumulation while you have only cross-sectional data. I mean, which is somehow related to my next question on the identification strategy or the causalities of the link between this training with assets on the asset. Because, I mean, for your identification strategy or to claim that there is no selection bias, you rely more on the targeting effectiveness of the targeting by the administration than really having, I mean, you didn't have the chance, of course, to do some kind of randomized control mechanisms. But I mean, when I look at the asset accumulation table that you showed us earlier, it is, the way I see it is, I think there is some kind of correlations between this, I mean, a sign of self-selection, so to speak, like, because you have this, those who get the training instead of the causality. I will say it's more of a correlation, that they are the ones with better asset accumulations as compared to those who do not get the training. So it would be, I mean, to give the confidence to the readers that there is little selection bias or a genetic problem, would it be possible for you to show this balancing table using the observable household characteristics, that those who get the training versus those who do not really match across the observations that you have? The other issue is you try to look at the impact of this training with asset distributions on milk production, milk consumption, and sales of milk. For me, I think it would be also interesting to look at the processing products that comes out of milk. I don't know whether you had the chance to collect data on milk products like butter or cheese, that kind of. So if there is data, I think it would be interesting to really also look, because the gap between consumption and the sale of milk could be like these processed products out of milk. So it would be nice if you can shed us some light on that also. The other, more of like clarification that would be nice to hear from you is on the intervention or the treatment that you mentioned. It's kind of like a bundled intervention that I don't know, I'm like, you may correct me if I'm wrong. When I go through the paper, I think this kind of the training is somehow bundled with some of it is like with loan, some of it with medicine, and some of it with preparations of feed or preparations of shed. So, I mean, you have so many things bundled in one variable that is kind of maybe distorting the results. So, is there a chance that you can also show this, I mean, you disaggregate this training by these different bundles of benefits that these households get and show the results, whether you have a robust or, yeah. So these are my comments, and thank you again.
Maybe I answer these questions, and then if someone has another one already, we need to use the microphone because it's filmed, so then we can already pass the microphone. So thank you very much for those comments. They'll be useful in the next revision. It's, by the way, very early work. I'll just go through them one by one. In terms of the asset accumulation, it's true we have cross-sectional data only. We do ask them, though, how many assets they did have before they received the cow, which obviously there might be recall bias involved. But we have this information and account for it, so the problem should be reduced. Maybe I'm a bit more positive than you about it. In terms of the selection in the community, that it's about whom we rely on, that they use the criteria correctly. That's something, again, we're not so worried about, because what happened, there was some incidents in 2009 where they thought that not so poor people received these animals, they were taken away. Partly they were given back because these were maybe more influential people but still poor, but they were actually made sure that it's actually the poor people that are being reached with these animals and that meet the selection criteria. So is it more correlation or more causation? I guess everybody has to decide that for themselves, but from the information that we get and the data, surely you can't say there's no selection into it anymore at all, but we think it's more causation than correlation, and I think we show also that the results are quite robust to the different specification. But it is true, yeah, so we have the balancing table in the paper, so that's there. We show the means, we show the difference in the trained and non-trained. In terms of the butter and cheese, unfortunately, we don't have information on that. So we can't look at it. It would be interesting. And then your final point was this bundle. So, I have the table up. So whether they received anything with the training, that we can account for separately. And we're doing that here. So the loan, very few people received a loan. It was more maybe material for the shed. So that doesn't have any influence. So we can take that out of this training variable. We are able to look at the different types of trainings, but since only 30% received training, we could probably look at the shed building and feed. And we have done that, and you see some differences, though, that some is driven by one aspect of the training, some by the other, like you would also expect, I guess. So we have done that, but we're more confident about looking at in one because of variation than that we're reducing really our sample otherwise.
Do you have any information on costs, and if so, if that
analysis? We have a bit on prices, so we know what price they get for the milk, but costs we don't really have, unfortunately.
So a similar question on identification, but for a more pragmatic standpoint. Do you know just why was the training not provided everywhere? I mean, and most importantly, is the variation within sectors or within village, or is it across sector and across village? It would be, I think, useful to understand the process a little more.
It's both. It's within. Oh, sorry, I don't know.
And just quickly, a second point. I think so. When you talk about complementarities, in some ways, what you show is that there is a marginal added value of providing the training in addition to the assets, but it's not really the complementarity in the sense that you don't know whether providing the training. I mean, you're not unpacking sort of the full complementarity between the two and the skills. I don't know, you may also want to look at some of the literature that's look at skills versus training, because there is some of the unpacking on skills versus training. There is a bit less of skills in addition to assets, so you may want to position the paper in that literature. Just a suggestion.
Okay. May I answer why it goes? Just the variation is within and across. So we have it really all over the country. There's variation, but not. So there are some institutions that, so for example, concentrate on shed building. That concentrate specific, but it is all over basically. Yeah, and the complementarity. Well, one thing is that they wouldn't have a cow otherwise, so we can't just provide the training. That's obvious. But thank you for the otherwise. Well, if you have specific papers, we'll answer.
So thank you for an interesting talk. You talked about the benefits of the program. I think it would be useful if you could talk also a bit more or extend in your paper about the costs, so that you can talk about cost effectiveness and compare it to other programs.
Yep.
And also regarding cost effectiveness, it would be useful to study spillovers of the program, because the only treatment that there is you provide training. I can imagine that that doesn't have a high cost, but people can pass on knowledge also at a very low cost. So I wonder about positive externalities. Mm-hmm. If I know something about cows, I can share it with neighbors, etc. So, I mean, I think it would be very useful to look into these two aspects, costs and then positive spillover effects, and this would allow you to assess cost effectiveness and compare it to other programs.
Yeah, thanks. So I agree the spillover is interesting. Unfortunately, we can't do it with the data, but more generally, I think, so some of the NGOs don't provide training because they think there's already knowledge within the community enough and they can teach each other. So that would basically what we are referring to. So it would be very interesting to look at that. With the data, at least we can't. And costs, yeah, probably what we should do is to look at other data also. Maybe we could go back to some of the NGOs. The problem is that there's really a lot providing it. But I've just recently seen a study by Hi-Fi, and they say that it's about $1,500 to $3,000 per cow. So then, yeah, we could take some of this data and put it into context, I guess. Yeah, that's nice.
I think the conclusions are very positive. Mm-hmm. But I have a problem with the sustainability of such a project. Mm-hmm. Because in the African experience, especially when you are dealing with livestock, there are problems about disease, and then maybe the health and the weather, the environment, they all affect the animal, life, situations. So this one is just a snapshot, okay? And the story sounds very, very interesting. But I think the policymaker will be interested to know whether this thing will last long.
So partly, I mean, it is inbuilt in the design of the project through this passing on the gift that the program will be sustainable. But I fully agree with you. And then, in fact, we used the data, and actually, Jonathan, to write a report which also went to the government with some advices. And one of the things they are saying is that they shouldn't now keep on distributing too many cows, but rather concentrate, because then at some point there's too many cows and problems like diseases might come up, but rather concentrating on improving insemination rates, for example, which is a big problem, and it's one of the main barriers to producing milk and so on. So that, yeah, I agree that the sustainability question is rather now improving what is there than just keep on getting things out. Do we have time for another? Or? Anyone? Thank you very much.
Can you guys all hear me? I'm going to try and walk around, partly because I find that relaxing to do so when I'm presenting. Partly because the occasional sound of thunder might sort of keep everyone awake and going as we're in the last afternoon of the conference. So I'm presenting some joint work with Joanna Upton and Susanna Sandström, looking at the impact of cash and food transfers based on a randomized intervention in Niger. The basic story, or motivation, behind this work goes the following. If you were to wander around any random economics department, pretty much anywhere in the world, and you found some random economist, and said to him or her, if you're going to provide a benefit to individuals or households, should you... This might not be working. Okay. I'll just have to dance behind the podium. And you said to this person, do you think we should give beneficiaries cash or in kind? The typical economist would say some variant of some sarcastic comment like, of course it's obvious what you should do is you should provide people with cash. The fundamental reason for that is providing people cash gives them choice over how they use that transfer. Typically, you can do it faster than you can do an in-kind distribution. Often it's going to be cheaper. So in some sense, the standard economist's response to that question is, it's so obvious, why would you even bother to ask? And yet, if we look around the world, we see on an annual basis that billions of dollars of assistance are provided to beneficiaries in various forms of in-kind transfers. So either there's something going on that we don't understand, or there's a massive inefficiency here. So that's kind of the basic motivation of this work that I'm going to describe. It's part of a 4-country study where we worked with the World Food Programme, not only in Niger, but in rural Yemen, rural Uganda, and in urban Ecuador, all of which have the same basic design of randomizing a certain number of households to receive cash, other households to receive a food basket of equivalent value, in some cases also to provide vouchers. The randomized design, for all the reasons you guys are familiar with, is very nice to have. Niger itself is actually a very useful country to actually do this particular exercise in. There's a lot of humanitarian assistance, both in the form of cash and in-kind transfers. It's a very, very poor country, so in some sense, in a resource efficiency sense, this really matters to try and get this right. But it's also a country where, in fact, there are actually relatively well-functioning food markets. Of course, in the absence of well-functioning food markets, the case for providing an in-kind transfer, ceteris paribus, is going to be much stronger. But here, in fact, we don't have that particular constraint. And there's also an interest, both on the part of the government and also various donors, to actually move towards cash transfers and away from food. So we're working in Niger, specifically the Zinder region of Niger. It's fair to say, and somewhat sad to say, that when we describe Niger as a poor country, we are talking about it as a poor country in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. Really, unfortunately for these guys, it's one of the most miserable places on the world to live in, okay? They have the dubious honor of being second last, for example, on UNDP's Human Development Index. It's a really, really poor place. It's also a country which has been characterized by severe difficulties at various points in time in terms of food insecurity, in terms of availability and access. There was a famine in some parts of the country in 2005 and 2006. There were major humanitarian crises in 2010 and in 2012. The place we're working, where this particular study is situated, is a place called Zinder. And Zinder is actually an interesting place to work because within the Nigerian context, it's an area where again, we're doing this in relative terms, there is a relatively high level of local food production. There is relatively good market access for food to move both in and out. But it's also an area which seems to be very hard hit when there are these various crises occur. The intervention itself was implemented by the World Food Programme and various partners that it contracted with. It had basically 2 arms, one of which was cash, one of which was food. The delivery mode was that for a 3-month period, April, May, and June in 2011, households in selected villages could do public works. And these were largely sort of various types of environmental public works to try and prevent soil degradation. The timing for the public works this April, May, and June is a point in the time in the agricultural cycle where there are no agricultural activities going on, so it doesn't compete with other potential productive activities. The rains in this area start falling around June into July, which is when people switch into agricultural activities, and at that point in the project, for the following 3 months, half the households in each village were selected to receive 3 months of unconditional transfers. The food basket consisted of a basket of grains, of pulses, of oil, and a tiny bit of salt. The cash basket, the cash transfer was 25,000 CFA per month. Based on the information that we and WFP had, it meant that in the lead up to the intervention, that the cash basket and the food basket were going to be equivalent in value over the 6-month period. The magnitude of the transfer itself was actually relatively large. A rough order of thumb estimate would be that it increases households' per capita income on the order of 25%. So this is a big transfer. This being a big transfer, in combination with being a very poor area, meant, for example, that during the public works, is that everyone basically and all households take up these public works. There's not an issue of some people selecting in and out. Virtually everyone takes them up and works their full employment allotment, which is given to them. Maps are always a good idea if you're giving an afternoon presentation. Those of you who are graduate students, make a note of that. We have this kind of fancy gizmo for pointing. I'm not sure if I actually got it to work. It's pretty cool. Okay. So Zinder is right here. It's on this border between the green and yellow bits, which denote different degrees of food insecurity. So Zinder is arguably on the border between one of the better areas and into some of the worse areas. But the other thing I want you to notice is it lies directly north of Nigeria. And in fact, there was a lot of movement of grains back and forth across the Nigerian border, literally going from Nigeria straight up north and literally bypassing the area we're working in. And again, that reinforces other work that we did, which basically indicates that, in fact, this is in terms of substituting food for cash, this is a good place to do this particular pilot because there are lots of grains and other foods available. We also did take some photographs. Again, note for postgraduate students, photographs are a good idea for afternoon presentations. These are taken near the end of the rainy season, okay? So I want all you guys to think of a rainy season anywhere in Africa and think how lush and green it is. And what you can see is you see these kind of spindly stalks of grain. You can see a lot of sand. You can see a lot more sand, some shade, but not a lot of grass, for example. And we have it's an area where there's both, in some parts, the survey area is a mix of both agriculture and pastoralism. There are a group of pastoralists with some skinny-looking goats. Notice not a lot of other large animals. And once again, notice quite a lot of sand and not a lot of grass. And remember, this is at the end of the rainy season. So this is indeed a very poor area with very marginal agriculture. Our research design. We're working in the Mara district within Zinder. In order to do the public works, basically WFP and its partners set up a series of work sites. And we had 52 work sites altogether. Some in an area in sites which were basically largely agricultural, some of which had a mix of agricultural and pastoral activities. So the sample is divided into those two zones and then randomized within that. Either sites for getting cash for work, then followed by cash transfers, or getting food for work, followed by food transfers. There are 2 survey rounds. First, following the completion of the public works, all households and all evaluated villages were surveyed. And then there was a follow-up with recipients of the unconditional transfer recipients at the end of the unconditional transfer period. Now, for those of you who've been paying close attention, at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, wait a minute, hang on. You told me this started in April, going back several slides. And now you're telling me that your first survey is done following the end of public works, end of June into July. Where's the baseline? Okay, an excellent question. In fact, we do not have a pre-intervention baseline in this standard sense. The reason for this is that, as some of you will know who've worked in this part of the Sahel, Niger, as well as a number of other Sahelian countries, goes through periods of very intense insecurity. And at the time we were hoping to do the baseline, before the intervention started, it was one of those periods where particularly Westerners were being not only kidnapped, which is not so great, but also murdered in spectacular fashion. And there was a sense that we, if I had a choice between not having a baseline and not having the research team, we thought it was better to keep the research team. So we weren't able to do a baseline prior to the intervention. But we did do a number of things, one of which is in the first survey is we collected retrospective information on key household characteristics pre-intervention. So one of the things we can do, given our randomization, is we can test for balancing pre-intervention across the units over which we randomize. And on that score, we do just fine. We balance across all sorts of characteristics. When we run our regressions on our impact estimates, in fact, we also include a whole range of those covariates. So that's going to help us a lot. The second thing is we do collect, for example, market level data. So one of the things we can control for are not only levels of prices, but also changes in prices over time. So you think of those changes in prices as reflecting trends, which are going to affect both the villages selected into food and into cash, and that also helps us ensure us, actually gives us more confidence in these results. So that's going to help us with those things. The yellow card has just come up. I've just talked about the data and the balancing. We focus in particular on two outcome variables, one of which is something called a dietary diversity index, which is literally households, as part of the questionnaire, are given a list of foods and asked, have you consumed any of these over the last 7 days? And there are 25 different foods on this index. We also construct something called a food consumption score, where not only do we know about what foods people consume, but how often they were consumed in the last 7 days. And this food consumption score is a weighted sum of food groups consumed based on their dietary quality. And WFP, which uses this score a lot, breaks households into those which have poor food security based on the score, borderline, or acceptable. Now you might say to yourself, why do you do this? Why not collect a full food consumption module? Well, we were working in an area where, in fact, we had limited skill sets in terms of the enumerators we could use. We had a limited amount of time to be able to do the survey work. And a full consumption module was going to take us about 45 minutes. And these take only about 5 minutes. But also, we know from other work we've done with these types of scores, is at low and moderate levels, they correlate incredibly highly with caloric availability at the household level. So if you take this score methodology and you also have data on food consumption over the previous 7 days, typically households which are below this threshold of 35, this acceptable level, it's highly likely that they have caloric availability below 2,000 kilocalories per person per day, which is a typical cutoff we use for whether or not households are obtaining at least some minimal acceptable diet in terms of calories. So this particular indicator is actually quite a nice one in terms of looking at the impact of these cash and food transfers on the consumption, both the quantity and the quality of people's diets. In addition to that, we have a limited amount of information both on food and non-food expenditures. So with all that, for the reasons I explained, we have a single difference estimator, where YIW is our outcome of interest. We have a vector of these baseline household and village characteristics. And the covariate we're interested in is the parameter on whether or not you are randomized in to receiving food. And here are our key results. Okay, in the July survey, on the dietary diversity index, you have an increase of 0.35. The food consumption score goes up by about 4.5. If you also then look at the October round, the acceptable, being above and below the acceptable cutoff, rises by 10 or 12%, depending on whether or not you look in July and October, if you receive this food basket rather than this cash. So in other words, if you're randomized in to receive food, your diet improves relative to those households, other villages, that were randomized in to receive cash. And that kind of runs completely counter to our priors. And in fact, it certainly was kind of completely the opposite of the result that I think we expected to find. So what gives? Well, what I want to bring your attention to is the bottom panel of this table. Okay? One of the things we did as part of the questionnaire is we said to people, over the last 3 months, have you made larger purchases than usual of grains? And what you can see is that if you receive the food basket, you are much less likely to do so. These are results in terms of marginal effects, that you are 27% less likely to do so in July, 40% less likely to do in October. We also asked about the magnitudes of the 3 largest purchases you made. Clearly what people were doing is if they were getting cash, which is the opposite of getting food, is you are more likely to be making these bulk grain purchases and making actually very large purchases of these. Well, why might people do that? Well, remember these guys are really, really poor. Okay? A lot of people have caloric intakes which are well below minimum thresholds, we think, people should be consuming. They live in an environment where they know prices are going to be changing. What is the entirely rational thing for them to do, if they get cash, is to go out and basically buy cheap filling calories. So what these guys do is they basically go out and buy tubers, they buy bulk grains, and that's in some sense how they try and increase their food consumption. Ironically, in some sense, by constraining their choices, by making them consume this package of pulses, grains, and oils, in fact, we improve both their dietary quantity and their dietary quality. It's worth noting that if we look at other types of items, there's a little bit of heterogeneity in terms of how this plays out in terms of the cash in the food households. One thing which is worth noting is that food households spend less on various types of agricultural inputs, both in the likelihood they do so and in the amounts. And interestingly, if you receive food, you're less likely, or rather you spend less, on repairs on your house, and in particular in the period running up to the rainy season. So to summarize, in this particular context, households randomized into villages that receive a food basket experienced larger positive impacts on measures of food security and dietary diversity. By contrast, those households that received cash were much more likely to buy cheap calories, particularly bulk grains, in addition to making some of these other purchases. But also, too, it's important to note that context is very important here. That even though we're dealing in an area where food markets are functioning relatively well, it's also an area where, in fact, we can see people placing a lot of value on buying lots of cheap calories. In different environments where, for example, where people might be somewhat better off, it's not clear that that would continue to hold. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. And also I enjoyed reading the paper. And what I especially liked about this study is that you don't only look at, we do this and what comes out, but you actually look, I want to reach this, how can we do that in the best way? And for me, I think that is how, especially this RCT research, should in a way be going, and how can we deliver something rather than do we reach what we want to be doing, so that just becomes a part. And related to that, you have a bit of the discussion on costs of these different approaches. So I think it could even stand out a bit more in the paper, could become a separate section, because I think that's really nice in there. Then I have a number of comments, or rather questions, which might be just because some things could be explained a bit more, I don't know. So one of the things is that it's in the data that you presented, and the results is all for the unconditional households, right? So I was wondering, why did you choose to concentrate on the unconditional rather than the conditional ones? So what's the rationale behind that decision, and how do you think that might influence the results of, that you find? And then I would be interested, how was this selection done of these unconditional recipients? You say a little bit that it is so that they wouldn't be, time wouldn't be taken away for the harvest and the weeding. But in a footnote, it also says that the selection was done by within the community leaders, and partly on how many children they have and everything. So I think just the process behind the selection, and then also showing in how far are these people different. So just look at the conditional and unconditional ones. And also within the cash or the food. So does it make a difference who becomes unconditional depending on whether they get cash or food? Because this could also be driving some of the results that you do. So you do show some balances in table 1, but from what I understood, this is really just taking all the cash versus food, and not the sample you're actually looking at later. And you have data on all households on the first survey, so you can do that. Yeah, so then, okay. The next question, so then I was wondering, it would be nice if you could tell a little bit more what these households do to earn money. So we know that a lot of them are farmers, but is that the only source of income? How many sources of income do they have? What type of sources? So these people that don't have to work for this cash and food anymore, what do they do? Do they stop doing things? You do find that, well, let me see first, yeah. And that relates also to the finding that the people that receive cash seem to be spending more on food, seem to be spending more on non-food items. So I found that intriguing, and I think it would be very interesting to go a bit more into that, because you do find that those that receive cash spend some on food, but not everything, but those that receive food don't sell it. So where do they get the money to spend more than the ones that receive the cash? And partly, it seems to be driven by spending it on festivities, right? And I wonder whether there's anything cultural behind it, maybe. If I have all this food, all of a sudden I need to invite people or have some ceremonies. I don't know, I've just found it a very intriguing result, and I would like to hear a bit more about that. I think I'll leave it at that. I have some minor things, but we can discuss later.
Well, maybe what I'll do is I'll just give a very brief set of responses to some of those extremely helpful points. One of the things we did do in the context of this work is we got very detailed cost data on the cost of delivering the food and on the cash. And in particular, what we were interested in was actually trying to work out what the marginal costs were. Is that there are certain costs associated with this types of exercise which you're going to incur irrespective of whatever it is you're going to deliver, okay? So for example, the cost associated with working out where you're going to actually do this intervention is an example of a common cost. So what we wanted to focus on is what are the marginal costs of providing these different modalities. In this particular context, the food transfers on a per beneficiary basis are about 15% higher than the cash transfers, which surprised us in that it was actually such a small differential. What we think drives that are two things, one of which is that the NGOs who were delivering both food and cash were actually incredibly efficient about the way in which they thought about delivering the food. Okay, and in particular what they did is they just brought it all in at the beginning of this period, they constructed a granary, they hired someone to guard it, and then every 2 weeks they basically unlocked the granary and distributed food to the beneficiaries. Whereas with the cash, they basically came in and out every 2 weeks to deliver it. So we think that generated relatively higher costs in the cash. We also think that, relatively speaking, that WFP, since presumably no one from WFP is here, I can say this, did a poor job when they negotiated on the cash transfers. They should have actually been able to actually push down the cost of the transfers basically the money they paid out to the financial institutions who underpin the cash stuff. So in this case, the interesting thing is that food did cost more than cash, but not as much as we might have expected. The second point to note is that during the public works phase, the take-up is universal. I had this, what I thought was a really cool idea for a paper, right, which is that does the take-up of public works differ if you get cash or if you get food? And it turns out in really poor places, when people have no other income-generating opportunity available to themselves, it doesn't matter. Everybody took it up. So this idea of looking at basically the ITT, which is in effect what we have, as opposed to the treatment on the treated, basically is just not going to work here because in fact, it's everybody who takes these things up. One thing which I probably wasn't as careful about as explaining is the people we follow through in both July and in October are actually people who both do the public works and are selected in to receive the unconditional transfers. So it's the same households in both groups. The targeting point, though, is a very good one, and it's one we would like to take up in the future, because one of the things we know is that the NGOs that did this implementation were given targeting criteria. We know that there was absolutely no monitoring of the way in which that targeting was done. And it wasn't until basically actually finished after the endline survey that we actually had a good idea of who had actually been selected in. These places are differentiated in all sorts of interesting ways, and so one of the interesting things we would like to look at is how does, in fact, community targeting work in the absence of external monitoring, when in some communities you have homogeneity, in some communities you have all sorts of interesting dimensions of heterogeneity, but that will be some future work. I think the other point, sorry, to note is, interestingly, economists always assume that if you get a food transfer, you can always sell it, right, and just take money out in cash. Nobody does that. What's really neat is we ask the same question in all 4 countries, and no one in any of these 4 countries ever actually sells their food ration. It just doesn't happen. And, you know, if we think about it for a few minutes, that actually makes a whole lot of sense, right? So, for example, Dr. Bill Kinsey is here. I've known Bill for like a long, long time, maybe 20 years. If I kind of dug around in my pockets and said, Bill, hey, I just found this chocolate bar. Do you want to buy it from me? Even though he's known me for a long time, he's probably going to say, well, if you're just pulling it out of your pocket and you're offering it to sell it to me, probably it's just not very good. Okay, so why would I actually want to buy it from you? Similarly, in these very sort of poor contexts, people might take offense, right? They might say, well, you know, we have all these mutual ties back and forth between us. We have this culture of sharing. This idea of selling, socially, that's not so great. One of the things we're getting across all these countries is this idea that people can sell or transfer is just a wildly overrated idea. The other point, though, that does come out, and it kind of confounds this issue of where the money goes to, is we have detailed information on credit transactions. You're a money lender, okay, and you've lent money to these poor people, and all of a sudden you notice, because it's done in a really public way for transparency and corruption reasons, the guy you've lent money to has just got some cash. Well, what are you going to do? Well, of course, you're going to go up to him, right? And say, hey, I lent you some money, and I know you can pay me back right now. So one of the things we have, and we're working on this separately, is it appears that people who receive cash are much more likely, interestingly, both to be repaying loans and taking out new loans. And we think what happens is exactly the process I'm just describing, is that basically some of their cash, which they receive in transfer, in some sense gets picked up right away by the person they lent money to. But of course, they still need to borrow money, so they then go back and take out other loans subsequently.
So you partially answered my question in your last comment about fungibility. So I was basically surprised that you find that food is not fungible at all. And I was wondering whether it's, you say it's some maybe social stigma if they sell or something like that. But on the other hand, I think, well, they go probably every week to the market. They don't know these people and they could basically sell that. So maybe this fungibility, I don't know, maybe it's something like behavioral thing that they receive food package and then they think, well, that's the correct one that we should eat. Or yeah, if you could comment on that, I'm interested, yeah, what drives this result?
Just in terms of the design, or maybe I didn't get it correctly. You don't have a proper control group, isn't it? So you just have people receiving food or cash, because you probably want to see if there is a control group, if they also people receiving cash, they consume more food than the control. And also in light of the whole debate of where do you buy the food to provide, you already said that they were very efficient, but I just would like to know if they buy this food locally in the area, or they import it from, I don't know, the US, or where is it, and if this makes a difference. Thank you.
Thanks. It's great to have these results. As you know, the Nigerian government is rolling out a large-scale cash transfer program, so we need to talk more. But I had a few questions. First of all, in terms of the composition, I guess the composition of the food basket probably matters a lot. Could you talk a little bit about how you come up with the composition that you had? And related to this, could you explain a little bit in your food diversity index, how do your sort of increase of the components of that index map to actually the content of the food basket? In other words, is it the case that you have sort of your increase in your diversity index is driven by just those goods that are in the basket? And is there a different composition of, even though the average is lower in the cash transfer group? My second question was on savings. Have you looked at savings at all? And is it just that the cash transfer beneficiaries are savings part of what they got? And then lastly, when you talk about cost, you talk about the market price of the basket, or do you talk about, do you refer to the cost at which the WFP actually bought the food, which may be quite different? So thank you very much.
That was really interesting, so thank you. So just in terms of, we did some cash transfer work in Tawa and found very similar results in terms of the fact that people often bought their bulk grains first and then used it to pay off debts. And I raise that because I think that this is really interesting, but at the same point in time, even though both the cash and the food were equivalently valued, in fact, the purchasing power of the cash households was actually much less. Because at this point in time, between May, June, up until August, September, is the time that prices are about between 15 to 60% higher as compared to the harvest season. And so your dollar does not stretch as far, and after you buy a 20,000 sack of grain, you basically have 5,000 CFA left. So I think that might be interesting just to look at a little bit and to take into consideration. And secondly, you said that you had some price data. So do you have price data in terms of looking at whether or not these cash transfers potentially impacted local prices? Because if so, that could also be a double whammy for some of these cash households. Just interesting to think about.
Do you want to take these or more?
Well, by my count, my impression is the presentation has been a success because, by my count, in addition to your helpful remarks, I have 11 questions. But this is all a good thing, right? Okay, to walk through them. I think the first question was, could there also be a behavioral response, this idea that there's some tagging associated with receiving a food transfer? I think it's quite likely that that also could well be part of the story here, but we really can't distinguish it from a number of other stories we could tell. So I think it's a good point, and it would be really fun to set up some sort of experiment where you explicitly tagged or didn't tag some types of transfers and saw how that worked. It's correct, we do not have a pure control. We were working with WFP in an area of Niger in which in fact there had been a food emergency declared. And quite understandably, it was felt it was going to be unethical to basically withhold a transfer to people in an area where in fact they were not quite at the point of starving, but they were clearly in really very dire straits. The procurement was a mix of local, regional, and stuff that came in from the US. Sorry, I can't remember who in the audience asked that. And try as we could, we couldn't actually get the details from WFP as to what exactly had come from where. The composition of the basket, I'm going to be slightly lame here and say the details are written out in the paper. But the idea is basic idea is that you provide a relatively large amount of grains, basically for calories. The lentils provide a certain number of amino acids, as well as various types in proteins. And the fat, for Westerners and North Americans, this is a slightly strange thing to say. These guys' diets are actually deficient in fats, and you need a certain number of fats as part of a healthy diet. And also the fats aid in cooking, and they also are calorie dense. So that's the rationale behind all those things. They also, interestingly, provide salt, and again, that's partly for cooking. And it also means, of course, they can iodize the salt, which is also a very useful thing to do in the context of the basket. The questions about the food consumption score, I'd be happy to talk to you about it afterwards. It gets into all sorts of, be unfair to say, tedious technical detail. Why don't we just say, like, a lot of technical detail. Question number 7. Oh dear, okay. Sorry about this one. I wrote down purchase, but I can't actually remember. Oh yeah, okay. Got it. Okay, that one I'll come back to. Savings, I will check as to whether, I can't remember off the top of my head what sort of detail we have on that. One thing we also looked at is we wondered whether or not getting cash or food would actually induce different types of transfer behaviors across households. And we collected a lot of data on that to discover the answer appears probably not, which, oh well, that's the way that goes. On the purchasing power question, the way in which WFP tried to calculate the value of these things is used basically a sequence of basically prices from the region over both the kind of post-harvest low price period and also the period where prices were rising. And they basically took an average over that, basically saying is we're going to average with that mapping onto the 6 months in which we're actually going to do these transfers, recognizing that basically the idea was at the beginning that in fact that the cash, people getting cash in some sense on average might be coming slightly ahead, but at certain points they might actually, their purchasing power might fall. But one of the things we can do now, and it would be a good idea to do, is we actually know prices, certainly at very basic staples, is we actually can go back and see to what extent that was justified if it varied across seasons, and that would be a really good idea to do so. I like your idea of looking at the impact of prices on the markets. I'm not sure, though, we're going to have sufficient power to do so, and that would be the constraint. But it would, if nothing else, would just be good to actually, I can't remember if we've done this, but we could certainly just like map out the trends in areas served by food and cash and see what those look like.
I think there was question 12 and 13, but maybe we can keep those to the end and go to the next paper.
Okay. Well, so we've been talking about Rwanda already, and we've been talking about public works, and here it is, public works in Rwanda, a combination of the two previous topics. This paper looks at the very short-term impact of a public works intervention on the welfare of households in rural Rwanda. And it's a topic I've been sort of looking into for quite some time, and despite the long time, it's very preliminary and probably very superficial, so I'm quite glad for comments, suggestions of any sort. So here to already give you an impression of the public works that we're talking about, and given it's a picture for the afternoon sessions. This is terracing work, which is one of the main works that is done under this public works component in the north of Rwanda, actually. And the specific program that we're looking at here is the Vision 2020 Umurenge program, which is basically the country's flagship anti-poverty program that has been implemented since July 2008 and has basically been forming one of the key flagship programs under the medium-term development strategy of the country. Its implementation is phased, even so it's planned to be a nationwide program, and it has been starting in the 30 poorest sectors. So sectors is like the third level agglomeration in Rwanda after the district, so it's like a larger village agglomeration, and has then continuously been expanded by 30 sectors each year, and is currently operated in 180, well, some components only in 150, out of a total of 416 sectors in the country. So it's like about 1/3 coverage by now, but it's aiming at full national coverage by 2014, but that might be a bit delayed. The program itself has 3 components. So we have a public works component, a direct support component, and a financial services component. The public works component basically offers employment on public works projects for households that have labor available. The direct support component basically gives cash transfers to elderly, child-headed households, vulnerable households, and the credit scheme gives basically credits to the very poor. The aim of the program was to release the productive capacities, to improve livelihood assets, and to basically provide a safety net for those most vulnerable households in the communities. And its medium-term objective, as it was stated in the program document, is to reduce the extreme poverty from about 35.8% in 2005 to 24% by 2012. And actually spot on, by 2011, the latest poverty figures show that extreme poverty in Rwanda has declined to 24.1% by 2011. So they're almost there, but we don't actually know on how much of it is due to the VUP, and also given sort of its limited coverage, the effect, the poverty effect might actually not be so large. So as I said, we're not looking at all 3 components because they have started at different points in times, and the data that is available is quite limited. So here we're only concentrating on the public works intervention, which in its early phases was still the largest intervention that, well, ways larger than the direct support. And the public works intervention also had its specific objectives. So it was aiming at reducing the immediate consumption restrictions of the poor households and promoting building up of asset stocks. And then in the more longer to medium term, actually creating employment opportunities, improving community assets, and developing a sort of entrepreneurship culture. So, as I said, we're looking at the very short-term impact. So we'll basically look at the very first 2 objectives, to the extent to which the program and the transfer that you receive through the program then lifts your immediate consumption restrictions, and if it helps promoting accumulation of assets. So it's pretty straightforward, actually. Here are some of the features of the program. So given that it has this poverty target, actually the VUP and the public works are targeted at the poorest households in the community, and poor here means households that fall into the bottom 2 of a total of 6 poverty categories. Which household belongs to which category is actually determined in a participatory community meeting at the cell level, so at the village level, where they group all households into these poverty categories, and the poorest 2 are basically those in abject poverty that have, well, lack shelter, food, clothing, livestock, have hardly any land holdings. And once you fall into these 2 poverty categories, you're actually eligible for employment under the public works scheme for an initial eligibility period of 12 months. Thereafter, your eligibility is reassessed. So there's another community meeting, and they check again if you're still within these poorest 2 poverty categories, or if you have actually improved. And as soon as you do have some sort of livestock, you're actually pretty much graduated from these poorest 2 categories. In addition to being eligible for the public works, there's also a wage component. So the public works wages that are offered are pretty much similar to what is offered for farm labor work. Started off at about 700 Rwandan francs at the time the program started in 2008, and now runs about 1,000 to 1,200 Rwandan francs, which is $1.50 or €1.25 per day. An interesting feature about the program actually is that wages are paid directly into beneficiary bank accounts. So all beneficiaries of this program do hold a bank account. reducing a bit the risk of fraud, but there has been quite some delay in payments given sort of the initial phase of the program, and these wages are paid on a 2-weekly basis. And as a final feature, there's an information component coming with the program. So you have, the participants have these regular community meetings where they actually be informed about the best investment strategies, what to do with their money. They are kind of advised to save part of the amount that they are receiving. They are receiving sensitization in terms of the importance of health insurance, sanitation works, but it's a whole range, and it depends pretty much on the sector and the sector executive of what kind of information they receive. So it's not really standardized, but the messages are pretty much going into the same direction. Building up livestock is one, and trying to save as much as you can. Just to give you a bit of a sort of labor market characteristics of the situation. So Rwanda pretty much dominated by subsistence agriculture. The share of people actually doing own farm work has decreased dramatically due to a high pressure on land. So it was about 82% in 2005, now it's 62%. And the large sort of amount of people entering into the labor force rurally is actually going into wage farm work. But it shows that those ones are actually the ones that are more prone to poverty or extreme poverty. And the main issue we're actually facing is not unemployment, but underemployment. We see a lot of people having more than 2 jobs, which is quite, similar to a lot of other settings. And a large part of the population works less than 32 hours. Here, on average, the farm workers work about 27 hours. Farmers work about 23 hours. So they still have some capacity to do some additional work. For example, as participating in the VUP as part of their farming activities. However, we do not have uniform subscription into the program, so even so you might be eligible, we have quite some variation on people taking it up or not. And this depends very much on the sectors, and it depends very much on the kind of public works interventions that are offered, and reasons that have been given on why people are not participating in public works is the distance to the public works site. So Rwanda is a very hilly country, and as you've already heard, quite remote. It does take quite some time to get from A to B, and if you have to start public works at 7 o'clock in the morning, you need to leave your household at 5 in the morning to get to the public works site, and you spend quite some time then to get back home, so it might be just not worth it. Another issue is also household composition. So households with members of 1 of 2 actually tend to not so much participate, because they were arguing that, well, one of us needs to stay at home and look after the property, and that's actually the reason why they don't do it. And a lot of people did not like the 2 weekly payment schedule, so they prefer to actually have the money at the end of the day and not wait for it for 2 weeks. And then there has also been some rationing. So some community projects that were implemented actually offered more work than eligible people. Some offered not sufficient for the eligible people. In terms of the progress that we've seen so far, so in the first year the program was running, the main activity that was being done is terracing, but also some road construction. And still, even with the expansion, the program into the second year, still terracing is sort of the main activity because of the high pressure on land and soil degradation being a very big issue. And in total, in the first year, we had 37,180 people employed, and we see a constant increase also in the second year. So now, trying to look at the impact or the effect. We're here a bit limited to a single cross-sectional data, which has been, which is the 2009 VUP Poverty Survey that has been implemented under the responsibility of the Ministry of Local Governments of Rwanda, which is the responsible entity for the VUP. And the survey has been conducted in November 2009, 15 months after the launch of the program, and it covers a total of 90 sectors. So we're basically having the 30 sectors where the program has already been running since 2008, another 30 sectors where the program has been running for about 3 months, and then we have 30 sectors where the program has not been running at all, so which are complete controls. So what we are doing here is we're restricting actually the sample to only look at the actual participants and the eligible households within these 90 sectors. Yes, so households that would fall within the bottom 2 poverty categories and have 1 member that is able to work. And then we're using some complementary sources qualitative and also more quantitative, but I will not get into this. Here, just to give you an idea of where these sectors are located, so the red ones are the 2008 sectors, the blue ones are the ones that have been included in 2009, and the green ones are the complete controlled sectors. Now, given that we are not having this full take-up of the program, we are definitely having an issue of self-selection there, and also the program placement has not been random. So given that it was placed at the poorest sectors, and then sort of going to the second poorest sectors in the district and the third poorest sectors, there might be quite some regional differences. So in order to address these two aspects, we are trying, or what we're proposing here is a sort of amended matching methodology, hoping to reduce the selection bias a little bit. And what we're doing is basically we run a probit model of public works participation for households within the VUP sectors, so only including eligible and actual participants in VUP sectors, and then we use these coefficients to predict the probability to participate in the VUP program in the controlled sectors. And all the hypothetical participants are all these sort of potential participants in the non-VUP sectors which have a probability above 0.5, so which, well, it's like a 50-50 choice, and it's quite arbitrary in terms of cutoff. We consider them as being sort of hypothetical matches for our actual participants, and then we match them. And we actually test sort of on this arbitrary cutoff, and we can increase the cutoff to about 0.6, but with the sample is quite small, so then we're losing quite some observations to match them with. So there's a bit of a sensitivity issue there. But the matching seems actually to do quite well if we test it, because it shows that it does predict the decision to not participate in 91% of the cases, and the actual decision to participate in 68% of the cases if we try it out. And then as a final step to account for regional differences, we subtract from our matched sample basically the differences between the non-participants, arguing that these might pick up some regional effects. I'll not go into the descriptive statistics, and it's probably not very well readable. Just a comment, we actually might see some effect of substitution here, because we see that the yearly income from non-agricultural activities for these VUP participating households is lower than for other households, actually. But in total, the yearly income on average received from the VUP within 12 months has been about 70,400 Rwandan francs, which translates into 100 days of full labor, which is quite a lot, actually. I'll skip the determinants for the participation, but, well, it basically shows that the targeting actually does seem to work quite well in terms of it really reaches the poorest. And here coming to the results. So what do we find? From the matching, we actually see that per capita food expenditure has been increasing by about, well, 60%, almost comparing it to our hypothetical participants. We see an increase in expenditure in crop investment and livestock, and we also see a little bit of a positive effect actually from this crop investment in terms of agricultural output, which is not shown here, but it's also not significant. And then we do see quite strong effects in terms of increase in durable assets, productive assets, and in livestock. And these results also hold if we sort of control for the regional differences, and we are about similar in magnitude there. I'll skip the employment part and I'll wrap up. So basically what we can say, actually, we find some evidence that this public works component is quite successful in improving material welfare in the very short run. So we see an increase in assets. Concerning livestock, for example, an increase of about 0.4 tropical livestock units, which is about 2 goats on average, or about, if we would consider it in prices, 40,000 Rwandan francs, so about half the share that you get in transfers actually goes into assets. But from the more qualitative sort of information that we have, one of the main aspects, or one of the mechanisms actually that seems to be driving this asset formation so strongly seems to be the sensitization that these households have been getting. And a lot of the people actually said, well, when I got the money, I actually didn't know what to buy, but then, you know, they told me to buy a goat, so I bought a goat. Or my neighbor bought a goat, so I also bought a goat. So one aspect to definitely drill into more in the future. And then concerning sort of the real welfare impact, as soon as these households graduate from from the program, because now they have some assets and some livestock, they are probably no longer eligible for continuation under the public works component. They are very likely to actually fall back into poverty. So we're actually seeing that the effect is quite short term. Thank you.
So before her presentation, Renate said to me, these are preliminary results. I'm hoping to get some good comments. I also interpreted that statement as be nice to me, because these are preliminary results. And so I'm going to be. What I want to do is I want to start off with a general observation about the evaluation technique of social protection programs in Africa, and then make some specific comments about your paper. One issue, which is, of course, clear from the get-go in your presentation and some of the others we've heard this afternoon, is that you have a non-randomized design. And in fact, this is something we observe, in fact, very frequently over much of sub-Saharan Africa, which is that governments seem very, very reluctant to actually use randomized designs as a mechanism for assessment. That's not to say it happens, it never happens, but to say it's much more rare than we perceive it to be in, for example, Latin America, parts of Latin America or other parts of the world. It's important for people to remember, though, is that, in fact, many, for example, of the conditional cash transfer programs in Latin America are actually not randomized designs in terms of the evaluation. In some sense, our perception, I think, is driven by, I think, a relatively small number of countries where that took place. And in the case of Mexico, that of Progresa Oportunidades, which is, in some sense, the one everyone goes back and uses as a reference, the decision to randomize was made by the president of the country. Okay, and so at some level, there was an extraordinarily high level of political buy-in for that randomization. So all of which is to say, in a very roundabout fashion, is that you don't need to apologize for having a non-randomized design. I think what you do need to do, and you do some of this, but maybe you need to do a little more, is just be a little more cautious about the results, in terms of saying is that these results are robust, conditional on these assumptions being satisfied. In terms of the paper itself, I've got 4 observations. One of which is that it would be helpful for you to give us a better sense about the choice, of how the choice into public works actually works in practice. Okay? One story that I could imagine telling is that in a particular area, I've got a lot of people who actually want to work. But there is basically a rationing mechanism. There's only so many job spots available. So there's a selection process which is, by and large, either a program implementer or the community or some combination says you, and you guys all satisfy the criteria, but we only have jobs for 4 of you, so we're really sorry, oh well, we can't put you in. Okay? And for example, in Ethiopia's PSNP program, that's basically the mechanism. And of course, it's kind of horrible for the poor person who gets left out. From the perspective of the evaluators, it's great, right? Because in effect, once you condition on observables, being selected in or out is essentially random, which means matching methods become more plausible as a mechanism. So you can imagine that's one possible approach. A second approach is to say there are jobs for everybody. It's up to you as to whether or not you want to take them up. In which case, the real issue you want to address is, in some sense, people's decision to self-select into this particular program. Now, the way you describe the process in Rwanda makes me think you're thinking a lot more about the second world than the first world. Right, that people are trying to select in or not. But if you look at your probate results, right, if you're in the poorest category relative to the next poorest category, the likelihood you take up public works is 99%. Okay? So that tells me, in fact, you're much more likely to be in the first world than the second. Okay? So I think it would be very helpful for you, and then I think for the understanding the results, to actually kind of decide which mechanisms you actually really think are the right ones. As you say, and you're correct in being cautious about this, is you have basically a single cross-section in which you want to try and generate these impact estimates. What that means is I think you want to convince your readers that you control for every possible relevant observable that you can. Okay? And in particular, given that you have participants, you've got participants in one area and you're comparing them against a hypothetical participant in a different area, you want to control or you want to match on as many locational characteristics as you possibly can. Okay? And you've got a couple in there. But I think your results would be more robust and I think more convincing if you basically saturated that probit model with many, many locational characteristics. And that would certainly help. The effects on certain types of expenditure categories are enormously large, okay? And maybe so large that they might actually give you some pause. So the kind of back of the envelope calculation I was doing was this, is that your impacts on food consumption expenditure are somewhere between 30 and 60%. Supposing I believe the elasticity of food consumption expenditure vis-a-vis income was 0.5. Well, that would imply that you're talking about an income increase of somewhere between 60 and 120%, which is a really, really big number in some sense. And so one of the things you could do to assess the plausibility of those results is try and do exactly that sort of calculation. How much of people's incomes actually have actually risen? And given that rise, how plausible are your particular results? And then the final point I want to make is the point about the impact on asset accumulation, particularly livestock. One of the things I think you correctly did in your presentation is you said, well, people are in this program, but they're also told that once they reach a certain threshold, they're going to be graduated out, and other people might take their place, okay? And you also expressed that, people were very worried about this, that they might be pushed out of the program prematurely. So take that idea. Now, instead of thinking that you're talking about these small, poor people and poor smallholders in Rwanda, think about you teaching like a first-year class in macroeconomics, okay, or second-year macro, depending on the curriculum, right? And you're teaching Friedman's permanent income hypothesis. What would you be saying? Well, you'd be saying when people experience a positive transitory income shock, the rational thing for them to do is to save rather than consume, okay? So you take that idea and then you transplant it back to Rwanda, and what you're saying is you've got an environment where people are being told you're getting this positive income shock, but you shouldn't regard it as being permanent. What would we predict people would do is we would predict people would actually accumulate assets, which is perhaps, I think, another explanation for why you observe that asset accumulation result. But with that, congratulations, and we look forward to seeing the next version.
Well, thanks a lot for your comments and for being rather kind. Definitely very helpful, and I do agree with you on the selection issue, and that, yes, definitely the poorest of the poor don't have a choice, and that's why they do take it up, and that's quite clear. But what is less clear is really on these sort of second poorest on the verge of actually jumping over the cliff. And they're really sort of from the qualitative work, from speaking to managerial staff, there is a big selection issue actually. So that's why I was trying to account for it, and I still think that it has to be done. With respect to the asset accumulation point, actually in the beginning people did not know that they would graduate out of the program, and a lot of the people are actually struck by surprise when they all of a sudden are told that they're no longer participants. So they don't actually know how it happens, and when you talk to them, it's actually a lot of the statements that we got was, okay, so yeah, I don't know why I'm no longer allowed to participate, I don't know why I'm no longer having an income, I cannot buy any food anymore, but I don't know how the whole process works. So there's definitely also an information restriction there. Yeah, so. Oh, no, thanks. Any other questions?
Thank you. Very interesting. So, if I understood you correctly, you said that in the end, the Food for Work programs actually led to an increase in asset holdings for the participants compared to the non-participants. And you actually said so, the program led to an increase in asset holdings. But I want to pose like an alternative hypothesis, and that's actually that's based on the fact that a lot of households use assets to sell in bad times to actually smooth their consumption pattern. And because you do not have baseline data, you cannot see whether actually the assets of the participants increased or whether the asset holdings of the non-participants decreased because they had to use assets to smooth consumption, while the Food for Work program participants actually didn't have to sell assets because they could smooth consumption out of their, they didn't have to smooth consumption, they just maintained their income.
Thank you. As you know, this is really the main anti-poverty program in Rwanda, so it's great to see actually some numbers. I think John made the point about the importance of adding more control. I thought like a second order issue, maybe given you have a fairly small sample, it may be useful to have some sensitivity analysis around the choice of the matching estimator than you choose. It's not going to help with endogeneity so much, but at least to get a sense of the robustness of the results. Secondly, I actually was a little unclear about how you deal with, so you have households that have been in the program for 15 months, households that have been in the program for 3 months, and so if you understand together, you pull them in the same group, right? Okay, so maybe you can clarify this. Maybe I'm confused. And then thirdly, you suggest that sensitization mattered a lot. You also, from a qualitative standpoint, but you also mentioned some other components of the program, the direct support and the sort of the graduation angle. Were they not implemented at all in those villages, or could there be some spillovers from those other parts of the bigger package in your results? Thank you.
Oops. Well, thanks for your comments. Concerning the increase in asset holdings, well, we actually do see also an increase in expenditures looking at certain types of household expendables. And there we do see that the expenses are bigger for those participating households. So they're actually buying new assets, yes, but we can't really say if the other ones are selling. So yeah, those we don't know. So point well taken. Concerning sensitivity issues, we do check on different matching practices, trying to set different thresholds, and the results are more or less robust. There's a little bit of a balancing issue when the sample becomes too small. Okay, here the impact is really only on households that have been in the program for 12 months. So we're actually taking away those that have been in the program for the 3 months, potentially. Also because we're not observing many that have actually gotten their money. Because in the beginning, the program had quite substantial delays in the payments. So they were not effectuated every 2 weeks, but rather sort of as bulk payments at the end of a 3-month period or something. Spillovers to the direct support component is actually really, really small. So it targets let's say, in a village, it targets about, 3-4 elderly households. So the spillover effects are not really massive. The real spillover effects to be to come out of the program are rather coming from this financial services component, which we are not taking into consideration here because it wasn't implemented at that point in time yet. But that would be definitely sort of the bigger impact to look at.
Any other questions?
Sorry, so just clarification. So you use the consumption as outcome variable. So one of the difficulty in using the consumption as an outcome variable in the variation of the food public works is that energy requirement will be changed for the participant and non-participant. So poverty line should be differently defined. So do you have other variable like outcome variables like a nutrition? No, that's the only variable.
No, unfortunately not.
So, or do you have any qualitative observation on that point? So that's a change of the nutrition requirements.
Actually, we have sort of dummy indicators in terms of if they consume more proteins now than they used to before. And actually, there's not much effect there at all. So they seem to still stay with their staple diet, but just consume more of it. So it basically goes from having 1 meal a day to 2 meals a day, but this is still mostly ugali or fufu, maize-based staples.
Okay, thank you. Thanks. We move to the last.
Thank you very much. So over the course of my presentation, I will try to talk about how secure access to land can be used as a safety net to improve food security of smallholder farmers in the case of Ethiopia. This is a work in progress with my former colleague Stein Holden. So in this paper, we try to really look at the impact of tenure security in the form of land use certification on food availability and nutritional status of members of the household. As kind of motivation for this paper, I mean, due to past failures in land titling programs, mainly in Africa, there has been reluctance in terms of these land tenure reforms in the continent. But due to recent phenomena in the form of like foreign interest in agricultural land in Africa, population pressure, or urbanization, the profile of land has changed, and land policy becomes high on the policy and development agenda. And we see many African countries now implementing mega projects of land titling programs. So what we've tried to do here is like we want to shed light in terms of like how poor are these land tenure reforms in Africa using the case of the land certification program in Ethiopia. So as a bit of background on this study, I mean, following the abolition of the feudal system in Ethiopia, the socialist regime has really abolished the feudal system, and land becomes under state ownership, and there has been like restrictions on the operations of land and labor transactions in the country, and the government has introduced this like egalitarian motto of land to the tiller, that there has been like frequent redistributions of land in the country. And this frequent redistribution of land in Ethiopia caused this unprecedented tenure insecurity, because householders start to feel that they may lose the land because of these administrative revolutionary land redistributions. So following the downfall of the socialist regime during the early 1990s, the current regime has somehow tried to introduce more market-friendly reforms in the form of like halting the frequent administrative redistribution of land, and at the same time try to introduce more market-friendly reforms like allowing the labor and farm labor and land transactions in the country. In addition to that, like to somehow mitigate this unprecedented tenure insecurity of the past regime due to these administrative land redistributions, the government tried to introduce these low-cost land tenure reforms in the form of like providing land use certificates that provides perpetuity of land use rights to the farmers and smallholder sector in the country. And when we see the recent reforms in the country, what we see is that in addition to this issuing of land certificates that provides this unlimited use rights to the farmers, the government has tried also to introduce some improving in the land governance system in terms of like decentralization, the land administration system. But again, due to this urbanization and population pressure in the rural as well as urban areas, now what we see is more of like a restriction in the functioning of these land rental markets. And of course, like the government tries to confiscate farmers who really stay out of their village so that they can be redistributed to the newly wedded or young farmers. So in this paper, what we are trying to do is to really look at how this low-cost land administration reform in the form of like issuing land use certificates in the region tries to provide this safety net role of the land so that these farmers can use the land as a kind of like springboard to graduate themselves out of poverty. So when we talk about this land titling or land intervention, land tenure intervention in Ethiopia, what we are talking about is a simple certificate of a piece of paper that really tells that Mr. X owns the parcel. There is no clear kind of demarcations with GPS coordinates, but what it tells is that that parcel really belongs to the particular person, and that part of intervention was effective in a way to solve the tenure insecurity of the past regime due to this redistribution of land. The cause of insecurity was really the ownership, not really the boundary or the dispute problems or the boundary disputes. when we try to look at the justifications why land reforms or property right reforms are really justified to improve agricultural productivity, or so be it improve the food security, emanates from the neoclassical argument that ill-defined property rights really cause the insecurity because of, it can be like due to border disputes with neighbors, or due to the risk of loss of land due to government expropriations that is witnessed during the socialist regime in the country. And because of this tenure insecurity, households will be reluctant to engage themselves in long-term land investments, be it in the form of technology adoption or engage themselves in soil and water conservation, or it can be due to the mortgage effects, so to speak, that households will not be able to use the land as collateral to borrow money from the credit institutions. And the third channel through which this tenure insecurity or due to the ill-defined property rights can affect agricultural productivity or production efficiency is due to the transferability of land. It may really reduce that households who they consider themselves as less efficient farmers will not be able to rent out or sell the land to more efficient farmers because of the tenure insecurity. So interventions by the government, for instance, in the case of Ethiopia, this low-cost land certification program can really help farmers to enhance their tenure security. And this enhanced tenure security can really have a productivity effect, or the indirect effect on food security, either through these investment effects that households who feel more secure about the ownership of the land will engage themselves in these long-term investments in the form of technology adoption or conservation investment in conservation structures. And the other route through which this tenure security can affect productivity, agricultural productivity, is through the transferability effects, that those less efficient farmers will now be able to really transact the land to a more efficient farmers and reap the benefits of this in the form of Ethiopia, the sharecropping mechanisms. And the third route that I mentioned before is the mortgage effect. But of course, in Ethiopia, the current system is still land is stately owned, and there is no possibility of using this land as a collateral to access credit. So we were not able to look at this route or channel through which this tenure security can affect agricultural productivity. So what we're trying to do in this paper is to really not only look at the food security effects of the land certification program, but we also try to look at what are the channels through which farmers are reaping the benefits of this improved tenure security through the land certification program. Either is it through the investment effects or the transferability effects of like lubricating the land rental market. So, there has been earlier studies from the same study area and from the rest of the country that shows that, yes, the land certification program, this low-cost land certification program, has really benefited farmers in the form of like increasing their investments, that farmers start to really engage themselves in long-term investments in the form of technology adoption or conservation structures. And earlier study from the same study area also shows that this intervention in the form of the low-cost land certification has really dampened the border disputes between farmers because of the effects of this land certification program. And the other effects that we saw from the intervention era, from the same study era, is the impacts on this transferability effects, that yes, this land certification program has really helped farmers to transact the land transfer of land from the less efficient farmers to a more efficient farmers. So the objective of this paper, as I mentioned earlier, is to really look at how proper is this intervention in terms of like increasing the food security of farmers through this improved tenure security in the form of low-cost land use certification program in the country. And we tried to look at various hypotheses that land certification has enhanced food security in the form of calorie availability for farm households. And the other hypothesis that we are trying to look is this: it increases this food availability or food security of farmers, one, through the investment effects, that agricultural productivity of those parcels that farmers have land use certificates has increased because of these investment effects in the form of technology adoption or conservation structures. And the other route through which this effect of tenure security on food security could be due to the transferability effects, that the less efficient farmers transacting their land to more efficient farmers. And we also had the chance to look at the nutritional effects. We tried to use the body mass index of members of the household or children under the age of 16, and we tried to look at how this having a land certificate really affects the nutritional status of these family members. And for this purpose, like I mentioned, we tried to use the data from Ethiopia in the northern highlands of Ethiopia with Tigray, and this area is unique in a way that it's the first region in the country to introduce the land certification program in 1998. And this first survey, our first survey, we used the 5-year balanced panel data, and the first survey coincides with the introduction of this intervention, so that we had the chance to use this survey as a kind of a baseline survey. So there comes the problem, the methodological challenge that we have been talking so far, that the identification strategy, even if the 1998, the first survey coincides with the beginning of the intervention, it was not really possible to really compare households with certificate versus households without certificate, only because this was like kind of a one-shot large-scale project that within 2 years' time, more than 80% of the farm households in the region possess this land use certificate. So we were not able to compare these households with certificate versus households without certificate. Instead, we got a helping hand from the rollout strategy that there has been administrative reasons in terms of like issuing these certificates. There has been like kind of time gap in terms of like who gets these certificates first and who gets. And these administrative reasons were like the border dispute with Eritrea during the late 90s has caused some delays in terms of issuing the certificate. And the other reasons are like in terms of like the lack of the enough certificates or the documents to be issued to the farmers has really caused some farmers to get these certificates 2 or 3 years after some of the farmers. So we use these years with certificate as kind of treatment variable, and that's strategic enough for us, because when we look at the tenure security effects of this land use certificate intervention, it's somehow some of the benefits that farmers can reap from this intervention kind of long term. As I mentioned before, it can be, especially if it is through the investment effects of this intervention, it may take some time for these farmers to really reap the benefits of the improved tenure security. So we believe this variable or instrument really provides us the opportunity to use it as treatment. And like I mentioned, to really control the dynamics of the effects of these land use certificates, we try to use the narrowing down the survey periods to really look at, look at a linear effects of this tenure security on food security, or non-linearity in terms of the inverted U-shaped relationships of tenure security on food security. Like I said, I mean, the more periods the households are with land use certificates can really improve their tenure security in terms of investment effects, but at the same time, the longer they have these land use certificates, the gap between, for instance, having the land use certificate for 8 years versus those households for 9 years can really be kind of like degrading effects. So we try to look at these effects by narrowing the survey periods in terms of like dropping the earlier surveys and look at the later years. And like I mentioned, we use the food availability, or more or less similar with the consumption-based approach that to control for food security. And in addition to this food availability, we tried also to use the body mass index of the members of the household, the young children under the age of 16. So yeah, we use fixed effects because of this 5-year panel data. We had the chance to use these household fixed effect models to test and to show the baseline survey. As I mentioned, it's quite interesting to look at like almost 50% of the households during the 19 or the first survey shows that they have a fear of losing the land. And of course, it's not shown here, but when we look at the same effects during the last survey, that's the 2009-2010 survey, only 21% of the households had this fear of land. And we can really see that households really benefit from this intervention in terms of, and this diagram shows the gender differential effects of these land use certificates on food availability or the calorie availability of male-headed versus female-headed households. The top one shows that before the intervention, and what we see on the bottom one is that there is clearly that female-headed households seem to benefit more from this land use certification intervention as compared to male-headed households. We tried also to look at the benefits of these land use certificates by looking at the status of households in the land rental market, whether they are tenants versus landlords versus those non-participants or the autarky position. And partly due to the indigeneity of these variables, I mean, the result seems to be a bit complicated. So, as I mentioned in the hypothesis, the first thing that we try to look at is how this intervention in terms of land certification program in the country has really affected the food security in terms of the calorie availability. And as we can see from the years with certificate, it shows that not only that land certificates can really contribute to the food availability of households, but the effect goes on like increasing, and both the magnitude and the significance level of this variable increases. And the other interesting result that we look at is the gender effects, and as the descriptive or the kernel density diagrams that I showed earlier, female-headed households seem to benefit more from this intervention because, I mean, if, for instance, I mean, one route through which this land certification program affects food security is through these transferability effects of the land rental market. And when we look at female-headed households, they are the less able parts of households who can really struggle to operate the farm themselves. And this tenure security really enhances their possibility of using the land as kind of transacting and reap the benefits through the sharecropping arrangements, and results shows that female-headed. And the other result that we try to look at is, what's the root, the differential effects, investment effects versus transferability effects, and to look at to differentiate these investment effects versus transferability effects, we run the models again using the ratio of operational holding divided by the farm-owned holding. Operational holding divided by own holding really means that how does more access to land through the land rental market affects the food availability or tenure security of farmers. And it shows that there is a significant contribution that increased access to land through the land rental market seems to contribute to the food availability or food security of farm households. And even if, I mean, this result shows that there is a possibility that farmers benefit from the transferability of land due to tenure security, we can't really see whether the differential effects, whether tenants versus landlords, landlords versus the autarky or non-participants. So we tried to run the same model, trying to disaggregate our sample size, that tenants versus landlords, and it seems to be that tenants are the ones who benefit more from these transferability effects of the land use certificates, as it's shown from the first column. And we tried to aggregate everything, and when we ran the model, it really shows the result seems to be robust, that tenant households benefits from this land use certification program because of the supply constrained nature of the land rental market in the country. And at the same time, we try to look at the dynamic effects of land certification program on the food availability of these households, and the result seems to be consistent that yes, the year with certificate is positive and significant across all these narrowed down surveys that shows this. There is an increasing effect of the tenure security effects on food availability. And the other thing that we tried to look at is the body mass index, and maybe because of the short nature of the panel, because we only had this body mass index information or the nutritional status of children information during the last two surveys, not starting from 98. So because of this narrow nature of the panel, maybe that the results doesn't seem to be robust, but it shows that there is some kind of indication that the year with certificate has a positive effect on the food availability. So more or less the results shows that yes, this intervention seems to really improve the food availability or tenure security of households, both through the investment effects and the transferability effects or the land rental markets. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hossein, thank you for your very interesting talk and a more comprehensive and even more interesting paper. And given that I'm not a specialist on land issues, your paper is actually quite nice from a discussant's perspective, because it has a quite elaborate literature review where you're trying to actually deduce potential causal change between this tenure security and investment and going down into food security, where you're also talking about migration, the effect of shocks, potential labor allocation effects, and the PSNP, and then coming to the actual empirical part of your paper, you seem to be very much reducing this again to the land rental question. So I wonder, given that you've done all this sort of literature work on if you cannot actually explore some of the channels that you're like laying out there quite nicely, a bit more in the paper. So one of the questions, or a few questions that I actually had, so given that you have increased tenure security, does this change, like if you're planting food or cash crops, for example, and that would then also fit into your food security question, I believe. Also, you have the PSNP, which is running, and you're actually saying that households do this cash for work or food for work programs, but then you're not really controlling for the intervention and how that is actually affecting households and their food security, because I think, at least in the short term, that might have quite some effect, and I think John found that it did. So, another question was, looking particularly at your BMIs, if you have a shock that occurred in the year before, your BMI might actually be quite sensible to very short-term shocks. So it's not a rather long-term measure, but it's quite having quite some variability. So I was wondering if, instead of using the BMI, which might also be subject to measurement error still, you might want to use stunting or wasting indicators also for robustness. And I was actually wondering if you can use a stunting indicator as a more long-term measure and only look at the children that were born at the time or just before the intervention and comparing those two groups. Because, I mean, obviously, well, the argument is that stunting particularly, or well, having a lack of nutrition, particularly during the first two years of your life, does have a quite lasting long-term effect, right? And if you would have, or if you could sort of, if you have a cohort before the intervention and you have a cohort after, and you can actually compare the two, then you could actually make a statement that yes, over the long term, it actually seemed to have a substantial increase on their nutritional value. A few sort of minor things striking is that your BMI figure seems to suggest that children in 2006 did better than in 2010. So have there been any shocks in the short term between those 2 years? Yeah, are your standard errors clustered? I believe so, but it doesn't really say in the paper. Concerning an IV, I have been thinking about it, but I couldn't find one. But if I come up with one, I'll let you know.
So, I mean, to give a very short answer to the last few questions about the nutritional part of the analysis, I mean, try to be very careful in terms of like interpreting the results. Like I said, I mean, it's only a 2-year gap between the two surveys, and the other issues, like we don't have this before land certification and after land certification. So yeah, we try to be very careful in terms of like, saying too much about the results of these nutritional aspects of if anything, we are looking at the correlations, not any causalities in this nutritional status. And the other thing is, I mean, we tried in the literature part of the paper, we tried to show the various causalities of this, tenure security and food security, and how other factors can really play a role in terms of like improving food security, and at the same time have some implications on the tenure security aspects, be it in the investment or land rental market activities. And one variable that you mentioned is this participation in the productive safety net, access to food through the food for work or cash for work programs. The dilemma that we really had, and we couldn't come up with any solution, is this endogeneity of this participation in the food for work program, because I mean it affects not only the food security, but it has its own correlations, I mean direct correlations with participation in the land rental market. Those who participate in food or cash for programs will have like less labor availability, so that maybe they could be the ones who really rent out their land and participate in this cash for work and food for work. So, I mean, we had the dilemma whether, I mean, we couldn't come up with any instruments that can really control for this food security aspects and not affecting the tenure security or the participation in the land rental market. So, I mean, throwing this variable into the equation is like adding more indigeneity problems to the already existing problem. So, our justification is that maybe, I mean, the effect of this participation in the productive safety net program could not be systematic enough to affect those with, I mean, the years with certificates versus those with, I mean, more years with certificate versus less years with certificate. So that's the only justification that we could come up. But yes, we really acknowledge that there is a potential indigeneity problem, and that's why we somehow decided not to throw another indigeneity headache to the to the problem. And the other question that you raised is whether there is kind of like systematic effects on cash crops versus annual crops, whether this tenure security has really effects. And yes, it does. I mean, we rely more on, I mean, part of the analysis for this paper is we rely on earlier studies done using the same data, the same study area. And our earlier study from the same study area shows that, yes, this intervention in the form of land use, issuing land use certificates really improve the households' investment in tree planting and perennial crops as compared to annual crops. So that's the case, and that has been documented from earlier studies.
Two questions. One, which I think you've partly answered, was the justification for using BMIs for children. The second, I haven't had a chance to read the paper yet, but from your periodization of results, there's an impression that the results grew weaker over time. That last period, 2006-2010, looked as though the outcomes were much weaker. Is that an erroneous impression, or is there actually something going on there?
Okay, so maybe I can.
I just have one question to add if there's no one. Maybe one other interesting dimension to look at for the heterogeneity would be for those households that said that they don't invest as much because they're afraid of the risk. So you could look at whether they have higher impacts. The people that report in the beginning that they invest less because of this risk. So you could see whether there's maybe a differential impact by that. Anyone else?
Yeah, so maybe I can start from your last question. That is, we see more of like weaker effects when we look at the later stage of the survey versus the beginning. And like I mentioned, I mean, there are two ways that we can explain the dynamic effects of the land certification program on food security and tenure security. And one is that, yes, there could be like an increasing effects of these land use certificates because of the long-term nature of some of the benefits in the form of like technology adoption or conservation investment in conservation structures. But at the same time, when we increase, I mean, when we look at the long-term effects, what could happen is these effects, the marginal effects of having a certificate for 1 extra year, comparing the 9th and the 10th year versus 1 extra year versus households with 3 years with certificate versus households with 4-year certificates, could be kind of like an eroding effect. Eroding effect in a way that, I mean, it's kind of like an inverted U kind of relationships of this tenure security effect of the land certification program. So, I mean, it's kind of expected, I mean, partly because of this, especially it's the last column that we see a weaker effects, and that is kind of like you see the first few years, we see an increasing effect of this tenure security, but it's kind of like downward sloping in the last few years. That's partly, like I mentioned, comparing the 9th and the 10th year with certificate versus comparing the 4th and the 3rd years with certificates. And the first question was, sorry, what was your first?
Justification for using BMIs for children.
Oh, yeah, I mean, so that's the only variable that we managed to collect. So that's the only reason. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we should close the session. Thanks for attending.